Welcome to this special podcast series. It's December 2025, and we are celebrating an incredible milestone, 20 years of shelter coordination. So grab a sofa, pour yourself a coffee, and settle in as we take you on a journey through 10 decades of collaboration, innovation, and impact.
In this series, we'll honor the people, partnerships, and breakthroughs that shaped our collective work. We'll celebrate achievements, reflect on lessons learned, and explore how coordination practices have evolved. Most importantly, we'll look ahead, asking how these insights can guide the next chapter of humanitarian coordination.
I'm Pablo Medina, joined by Seki Hirano, Global Shelter Cluster Coordinator. Each episode brings you voices from key influencers across different eras of the shelter cluster, sharing their experiences and perspectives.
Today's conversation takes us to 2004, the birth of the cluster system. Pablo and I will be hosting.
So grab a comfy seat and your favorite drink and join us as we dive into the stories behind the milestones and meet the people who made a real difference along the way. Welcome everyone to this special episode where we look back at the origins of the cluster approach and look forward to where we might be heading next as we design the new cluster, which brings together shelter, camp coordination and camp management, and housing land and property into a unified structure. We're in a moment of profound transformation in the humanitarian sector. With the humanitarian reset underway, we're being asked to rethink leadership, rethink how clusters serve communities, and rethink what coordination should look like for the next few decades. But before we look ahead, it's essential that we look back to understand what the cluster system was originally designed to do, what challenges it aimed to address, and how those early choices continue to shape our work today. And for that, we are very fortunate to have three extraordinary guests. People who were there when the cluster approach was conceived and who played central roles in shaping it. Margareta Wahlstrom, who was then Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Jamie McGoldrick, who headed the section of the Humanitarian Reform Support Unit, and Marc, who was working with Jamie to operationalize the changes brought about by the humanitarian reform. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. And before we get into where we're going, let's start a little bit of where it all began. Margareta, you were directly involved in the creation of the cluster approach back in 2005, 20 years ago. Could you bring us back to that moment and what problems you were all trying to solve and what the solution take in the shape of the cluster?
Well, thank you. I must confess, when you asked me this, I had to spend quite some time to think back. It was a long time ago, it feels like. But I think it's important for us to know, and for those that listen, that period was a period of reform within the entire UN system. The UN Secretary General was looking at the entire system. There was a sort of a big General Assembly in 2005 that set the task for also, sustainable development goals, millennium goals, as it was called at this time. So there was a period of change, which of course also touched the humanitarian system very fundamentally. So for us, and I think it's important to remember, it was a humanitarian reform, part of which was the cluster that, is a bit what you are working with, right? And I think there were some very concrete things. There were a couple of very concrete, I think, strongly felt limitations. One was the total capacity of the system. The question that we asked ourselves, can we as a humanitarian system, and think back at that time, it was really the international system, and I suspect very largely the UN. Can we actually respond to more than one big disaster at a time? Are we able to deploy three? I think colleagues talked a lot about three disasters. And if that's our ambition level, what do we need to do? During that period, we also had, very sadly, big humanitarian crisis in Darfur. And I remember that the ERC, Jan Egeland, he was so frustrated because he could not get agencies to focus on deployment in Darfur. They actually had what we felt, to be honest, then as excuses, no, we cannot move people from this one to that one, we don't have enough. So in that sort of sense of almost inability to move on something that was so in our face as a humanitarian crisis, we started thinking about functions, capacity, and roles, of course. And one of the ideas, there were actually three things that the system decided to do. Clusters wasn't the first, interestingly enough. The first was to make quick funding available, the SERF, establishment of the SERF, the Central Emergency Revolving Fund, which already existed as a small fund revolving. As the SERF developed, of course, we left the revolving behind and it became a contribution. Secondly was the leadership qualities. It was a constant tension between resident coordinators and humanitarian coordinators. I mean, just make a very long story very short. We started a major training and recruitment program to have a pool of capable competences in humanitarian quick action, but also to support the resident system with training resident coordinators in some of the fundamentals of leading humanitarian engagement. And thirdly was to look at how do we get the functions together? How can we make better use of the resources we have as a system, be it logistics, shelter, food, or whatever, and look at them. And that out of that idea, the cluster was born, and it was really born as emergency deployment. We, in the early days, actually worked on 4 clusters. That was what we felt was absolutely needed. I don't need to say to you what then happened. Everyone wanted a cluster for whatever they were doing. So that evolution actually went very quickly. Was it painless? No. There were a few things that were particularly difficult, but I will leave that also to Marc and Jamie to pick up on, because they, in a way, they were, of course, in the forefront of negotiating among agencies. But just to put the scene how it was a big systemic sort of critical thinking. And there were a couple of things that I don't think we thought very carefully about. States, host governments, of course, they were happy that we were trying to coordinate ourselves better. I mean, that's the eternal complaint or felt difficulty, that the competition was more important than actually good coordination and cooperation. So they were happy with this. The fact that we probably didn't count them into the cluster system was not very evident in the beginning, as you know. And the second thing that I just want to highlight as we start, there was the role of international NGOs and even more role of the national NGOs. I don't think we had much time to think about that at the time. And we had the IRC as a major actor, of course, in this process. So the NGOs, they were in a way represented there, but of course not as a big collective as they were. So I'll stop there now as a background.
Thank you, Margareta. And what a rich history that you've painted for us. Thank you for that. Maybe I'll go to Jamie. Jamie, from your vantage point, did clusters feel like the right thing, right solution at that time? Were there gaps in leadership, predictability, as clear to you on the operational side of things?
Well, I think Margareta's laid out the background, the history very, very clearly. And I think one of the things we tried to do was to get people engaged in it, to make it inclusive. But I think the problem was that we had to trade off a bit transactional in many ways. And I think Margareta's point about having 4 key clusters and then trying to keep that as the basis for emergency response. Because in an emergency response, I saw it myself in the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, the first time we used clusters, and I saw it myself again in 2015 when I was the head of the HC in the Nepal earthquake 2015. I tried to do what Margareta just said, keep to basic clusters for the emergency response and bring the other ones in later. And I think that was a real issue. I think the other issue that Margareta highlighted was the absence of discussion, real discussion with NGO community, in particular international, but also national. And I think that echo comes out in the World Humanitarian Summit and the lack of localization since then. So I think those operational issues were there. I think the other thing was we got too close to governments and we gave them co-chairing in certain circumstances. And I don't think that was the best way to go all the time, but some of the time and some of the clusters.
Thank you, Jamie. Margareta and Jamie, when you mentioned you were thinking of 4 clusters at the beginning, it brings me to the reset now, where we are reducing from 11 clusters to 8. Now, it's not the 4 that you had originally envisioned, but we are doing a little bit of reduction now. Marc, you were dealing with some of the early rollouts. What do you remember about those discussions at the beginning, the expectations, the anxieties, the hopes around the new coordination?
Well, I think the system was really very broken at the time. As Margareta said, we were dealing with this massive crisis in Darfur in Sudan in 2004, 2005. There was no agency that wanted to take on responsibility for the camps. There was no agency wanting to take on the leadership on the water side. There was no agency that wanted to take on leadership on the health side even. Remember, even WHO was not the lead in emergencies. The main actors in health and emergency were organizations like MSF and Médecins du Monde. The main actor for water and sanitation was Oxfam. So there were very big gaps in the system. I think once we started to roll this out in different countries, there was a lot of logic and people kind of accepted that the system did need more structure and discipline, which is why I think it took hold. But at the same time, there was enormous pushback from many of the agencies. And definitely most of the gray hair that I have today comes from that period. It was a very, very difficult process because agencies were obsessed with their own mandates. They didn't really want to think about the issues. They wanted to think about their own mandates. And the next thing that happened was just there was this extraordinary bureaucratization of what began as a very simple concept. The concept was about having clear lead agencies that would help to mobilize resources and ensure there was standards were met and they would just help to monitor and report and mobilize. But the other aspect was the partnership, and that's why they were called clusters, because it was about recognizing that there were many different actors, local actors, international actors, and there was a need to have a much stronger system of partnership, something that really brought together these two elements, leadership and partnership. Unfortunately, in the process of trying to kind of reconcile those tensions between partnership and leadership, a lot of documents were produced, a lot of, the bureaucracy just became very, very heavy. And I think that's been a problem ever since.
Yes, indeed. Some of the mandate issues, I think, still persist. The bureaucracy, we'll perhaps go into that a little bit later. But let's stay with you for a moment, Marc, then revisiting the original purpose of the cluster approach and looking now as things are. Does the purpose still hold? I forgot, Margareta, actually, that the question of can we deal with 3 big disasters at a time was also at the start of it. And I think we forgot that question along the way. So do you think, Marc, that purpose still holds today? And what are the 2 or 3 principles that clusters were built on? I've mentioned already partnership and leadership, probably. But as you look at the humanitarian response today, does the purpose still hold in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody should know what we were dealing with back in 2005. Before 2005, the whole system of international response to emergencies was much more ad hoc, random, and amateurish. You simply, coordination was simply a question of seeing who turns up, and then you get together in the room and you talk about what to do. The next day, the international spotlight has moved to another emergency, and that organization is gone. It was really very chaotic. And so I think, as of 2005, we started having a much more kind of structured system. But I think there was a problem. These two principles of partnership and of leadership, we never really quite got the balance right. I think when it comes to partnership, there was too much focus on international actors. There was too much focus on UN agencies. The system, it was also too much focus on kind of Western donors. It was a very kind of Westernized response. It wasn't the United Nations responding. It was the Western nations, and everything was kind of top down and a very kind of neo-colonial type of system. So I think the partnership, we did not get it quite right. And Jamie also mentioned how you bring governments in. We had not spent enough time focusing on really supporting local actors and finding ways of working with governments and local partners. And with governments, it's different. Obviously, in the response to an earthquake or a hurricane or a famine, you often have to work very closely with governments and support those governments, while in conflict situations, often governments themselves are party to the conflict. And so it's a very different situation. But I think a lot more work needed to be done to think through what is effective partnership in today's world. And it cannot be such an old-fashioned neo-colonial system. And then when it comes to leadership, the problem was we were thinking in a very kind of top-down, supply-driven way. And leadership actually, you need very strong leadership on the ground, but you need to recognize the leadership that local communities are already exerting. They are the first responders in emergencies, and local actors often have much more knowledge and understanding of the context. They're the ones that are best placed. And we need a system of leadership that really recognizes who's doing the responding, and often the kind of leadership that needs to be provided by those UN agencies and from the headquarters that are very far away is much more about mobilizing resources than about trying to kind of control the whole response on the ground. So I think a lot still to learn today about how to be more effective in both leadership and in partnership.
But can I just say on that, I mean, I think that the World Humanitarian Summit actually gave us an opportunity to reset the problem. The same agencies who are resisting and did resist at that time continue to do that. So that's why localization has never taken place. If you only have to look at the statistics, less than 2% of funding goes to local organizations, and that's even after the World Humanitarian Summit. If you look at the funding that goes to UN agencies, 60% of the humanitarian funds goes to the UN and 47% goes to 3 agencies, WFP, UNICEF and UNHCR. And that hegemony continues, and that's the way that the cluster system has gone. Localization is counterintuitive to the existing humanitarian system, and they have to change that. And I think the other problem for me is the leadership issue that Marc mentioned there, is that resident coordinators have a natural bent towards governments. Humanitarian coordinators don't have a natural bent towards governments. And some cluster lead agencies are very comfortable partnering with governments, regardless of be a conflict or an earthquake or whatever it was. And that, to me, caused a problem in the Nepal earthquake, for example, because some of the clusters had a very good relationship with the government, and it caused great problems when the earthquake didn't happen in Kathmandu, it happened in the provinces. And to try and regionalize that problem was a problem because the clusters were insistent on centralizing it in Kathmandu, for example.
Thanks, Marc and Jamie. A lot of issues. I think we still are struggling to digest and deal with these issues as we hit 2025. We talked a bit about this over bureaucracy. We've talked about getting out of chaos. We talked a little bit about kind of the effective partnership model and leadership. But then it kind of comes back to organizational structures, about mandates, about kind of where each organization is making a commitment or that they can commit to. What's your kind of take on the best solutions in kind of trying to navigate this for the future?
Can I remind also maybe Jamie and Marc and others about once that growth in clusters started, which there seemed to be no way that we could have stopped it or prevented it, but the ones that were most difficult to solve, you remember, were one so-called protection cluster, because exactly the relevant agencies have such strong mandates for different perspectives of protection that presumably money and other things comes with it, but also responsibilities. So that's one type of challenge to still think through in practice. Second, a huge dilemma was the one with the cluster on telecoms and logistics. Massive investments, efficiency in several agencies that have built up their own system over the years. And even though, as you mentioned, Mark, the logic was clear, but to give up on your responsibility was so difficult also because you believed you were more efficient when you could do it yourself, which was probably true in those days. So actually the whole system really, and I don't think you've really sorted out these things yet, but the question I ask myself, in those days, the UN and the humanitarian system, we were much more, I would say, self-focused. We were the system. Something happens, we acted, and sometimes we remember to ask the government if you are welcome to come and help them, sort of say. So that, didn't happen very often, but it did happen a few times that we negotiated for weeks before to get access. So it was a system that was built on that we sort of at global level will solve all these things. And maybe the days are gone for that. The solution no longer is that we try to sort out among ourselves in a relatively small community. And quite frankly, the money that goes through our system is still, it was then, much smaller than, the private sector, remittances, national governments. We've never been able to count that and develop that. Maybe our disappointment or deceit about the humanitarian summit outcomes on localization, there hasn't been any major change in that transaction where money is going. So can we look at the system from local, national level and up instead of from the top down? Then how can we deal with functions and structures, particularly because of the situation that UN is in now? Will it really reach the efficiency and the resource utilization, optimization, as they are talking about, if we tinker a bit with the top levels rather than actually sort out relations with governments, NGO system, local level organizations, and look at efficiency from that level? So I just want to throw that in.
Yeah, I would just add to that. The fact is, if we miss the opportunity now of doing localization, real localization, it will be a disaster. Because right now, with the budget cuts that are so severe, hampering the global level, as Margareta talks about, we can't fix the global level. We have to look directly at the local level. We have to get decentralized models of humanitarian response coordination. I saw it myself earlier this year in Afghanistan. We did a peer-to-peer mission there to talk about this off the back of budget cuts. And there was a massive resistance of taking the power and the decision-making away from Kabul to the provinces and making it an area-based coordination model, which actually embodied and empowered local actors into that who were better relevant. And it gave them the opportunity to do a blend of humanitarian and development type work. And it's based on what Marc was saying there as well. We have to, as humanitarians, have a different attitude and a different engagement with communities, no longer going in, dropping like DHL and leaving again. We have to stay there and work with the local leaders to address the local conflicts and work out a system that works. That's what we have to do. We can't keep talking about the global issue because the global issue shouldn't matter anymore.
Yeah, just I agree with those points very much. I think the system needs much bigger transformation than the one that I think we're seeing at the moment. Now, it's very understandable that at the moment a lot of the focus is on budget. So I understand it's very difficult what they're dealing with right now. But I think there needs to be a much more fundamental rethink about changing a system that was not only still quite antiquated and near-colonial, but in some ways it's actually somewhat racist, some of the way that we do business today. If you look at the humanitarian country teams in most countries, it is still the case that the great majority of the people in the room in those humanitarian country teams are foreigners. Sometimes the local actors, who are in those meetings, they're not empowered. So even if they're there in numbers, they're not the decision makers. And I think that needs to be turned on its head. And the whole system needs to be now one which is much more about, UN agencies and international organizations really looking at how they can support local actors to serve their own communities. Because we know that, there is so much capacity in most of those countries where we work. There are excellent local organizations. And I think we still have a structure which is far too top down. So I hope this next round of reforms will bring something much more radical, much more transformative. And it starts at the overall leadership level, but obviously it will filter down to each and every one of those clusters that I think needs to work in a very different way. You've got to turn that triangle on its head.
Yeah, I mean, just also sort of come in again, but just based on that point that Marc made, there are 2 points we have to recognise as the fact that given the time of budget cuts, I mean, I think it's a shame for organisations that are having to cut staff and downsize and all that. So that's a tragedy. But at the same time, it's a necessity right now. There's no getting away from it. We can't escape the reality of budget cuts. And if we're going to look at the needs of people who are affected by crisis more than the needs of the organisation, that's what we have to do. And in order to do that, we have to do local. We have to get more power, more resources, and more decision making and judgment to locals who are at the front line. And we have to bring the donors on board. There's a resistance in donors who allow more local actors to be involved because they keep claiming they're closer to those people who perpetrate the crimes. They're easily manipulated by power. They are corrupt. They don't have the same skill base. If you go to any crisis right now, even after 30 years of a humanitarian crisis, those NGOs are very experienced, very gifted, very well trained. There's no excuse for them not to be given the responsibility of responding to their own communities and the needs of those communities.
So it appears clear we know what we have to do, or at least one of the things we have to do, which is localization. It just turns out we knew that back in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit, and after 9 years, we haven't been able to advance much. So what is preventing us from doing it? What are the true barriers from us to move forward in that localization agenda? Localization is a massive aspect of the humanitarian reset. But we've seemed unable to do it. Why? What are those barriers we're unable?
Politics, agency politics and donor politics that don't want it to happen because they're one step away removed from local actor control. Right now you have donors sitting in executive boards who call the shots for agencies. And if you were to move away and give more power in humanitarian country teams or more power in clusters or a decentralized model, there's less control that the donor has over those actors. And I don't think that's something they want. And at the same time, it's the best interest of the international organizations who run the clusters, who mobilize the resource, who control the prioritization to keep that model there as well. The sad part is that money's running out, the needs are growing. So you're going to have to come up with some new, efficient, effective way of addressing those needs. Otherwise, you abandon millions of people to poverty, to hunger, to climate change. And that's something you can't be responsible for.
I think Jamie is right. All the actors that in the humanitarian summit and afterwards and before that could have made the change, they are speaking with forked tongues even today. Because, there is a politically correct thing to say, and there is another one that is based on domestic interests, taxpayers' money, all these kinds of things that are understandable in certain perspectives. But then if you believe that's the most important thing, then please don't make commitments that you will never live up to. I've talked to people I wasn't part of the summit, but I talked to people who were there, and I asked them from government side, why did you spend so much time in supporting these processes? And then, because there's one guy, he said, it was already clear before the summit closed that we were never going to be able to live up to the outcome. So I think for those of you as agencies, you kept trying to fulfill what responsibilities you took on. You've never had enough, even with your commitment, you never had enough support to make it happen. But I'm also saying, just like Jamie, that agencies also have agendas, and those agendas are formed by their political commitment in the board structure. So who can play? And I think the third issue here, all those countries that are not humanitarian actors, that are not sitting in donor support groups, group that are not giving big money, but all too often are the countries that are on the receiving side of our efforts to support them. They have changed dramatically in the past 30 years, all of them. They got competencies, they could very well handle a lot of these things on their own. So why don't they say no? Why don't they say, sorry, what you offer is not what we need? I think remains one of my big frustrations is they can complain to me, but I say, I can't fix the system. You have to fix the system. You are the shareholders of the UN. You are the member states of the Federation. Please speak up. Be more sort of frank in what you actually think the system is, because otherwise that silence becomes a complicit silence of not changing a system that needs change. Everyone is aware of that. It's an issue of money now, acutely again, not for the first time. But what can change it now is to actually get a conversation. I don't know if the time is now, but it's a great opportunity to at least initiate that kind of change that could be. And just to go back to your issue, clusters may still be needed. Clusters as, I think, necessary efforts to ensure to uphold the quality standard, to comply with national legislation, to actually deliver what is needed, but not over-deliver either, and to make sure that sort of basic humanitarian criteria is upheld. It's not, the good things that the system have been able to deliver, unevenly probably, are still needed, but needs to be managed in a very different manner, I would say.
As we move to the new cluster, obviously, when Marc was talking about what we face before the humanitarian reform, it looks a bit chaotic. So let's look a little bit at the positives. What positive things have the clusters brought to the humanitarian system? What worked well? We've talked a little bit about what we missed, but what worked well? What should we repeat or do more of as we move towards this new cluster for us?
Maybe just quickly, I would say that in some of the places I've worked, the thing that I liked about the clusters was the fact that you got a packaged view of that sector about what was coming. And I think you had, in some clusters, I remember in the Palestine context, there was 128 members of the protection cluster, which was a bit overcooked. But I think that if you were to have a more streamlined version of that, but an inclusive version and not tokenistic inclusion, so it's not like the token actors in there as well. So I think the inclusivity and the package set of priorities. But at the same time, there has to be, I would insist on co-chairing of clusters, because I think too often the lead agency mandate often directs the travel of the prioritization, the resource mobilization. So I'd say that there are some really good things that are happening there. And I'd say a more decentralized approach of using clusters away from the capital is where I think in some places that work.
Yeah, I agree with Jamie, and I think Pablo, you're right to make us not only dwell on the negative aspects, because I think a lot has improved over recent years when you think of what the system looked like 20, 30 years ago. Today we tend to find a much more comprehensive approach than used to happen in the past. I mean, everyone understands now that it's no good making sure people have enough food if they are going to die of lack of proper healthcare or clean water. And so there is an expectation, and the system has become good at having a very kind of systematic approach to these emergencies. But I do think there needs to be a lot more humility, a lot more listening to local actors and supporting those local actors. But yes, I think there's a lot that is working well. And I think these lead agencies, they can be very good at mobilizing resources. The problem is that they sometimes think very much in terms of their own visibility and kind of feel that they can't really raise resources unless they have their own people going in there with their own kind of flags and waistcoats and vests and logos. And it's in fact a lot of the lives that are saved in these emergencies. It's not by these kind of foreign organizations that fly in with Hercules and airdrops and convoys bringing supplies. A lot of it is done in much less visible ways, and there's a lot of assistance that you can bring in a much more low-profile way. But I think these UN agencies and the cluster lead agencies in general, not just the UN agencies, because they're not all UN, but IFRC and all the lead agencies. I think they need to focus on what they do best. They can be very good at the normative side with the standard setting, drawing the world's attention to these emergencies and helping to raise the funds. But it's not that they have to then spend those funds themselves. They could have a very different approach to how those funds are used. And also remembering that local actors, it's not only that they know the situation well, they're well placed, they know the language, they know the geography, they know the issues, but very often they are simply much better value for money. And as Jamie said, there is a problem with some of the donors that prefer the kind of the agencies that they know that fly in and that provide this aid because they like the visibility and so forth. And they do come up with this excuse that, you can't be sure to trust these organizations. They might be corrupt and so forth. In fact, whatever corruption there is, what I have found is that these local actors tend to be much better value for money than the current system. The system we have is extremely, extremely expensive and it's just not sustainable. So I think, yes, let's think what they do well. They're good at mobilizing, but they don't have to do everything themselves.
I think there are many good things with what the system is better structured, more intentional. Actually, one thing that I think happened was the endless debate about does coordination mean that you decide? I think Jamie mentioned there's a tendency of cluster lead to believe to drive the prioritization. So we can never solve that issue. It's a continuous conversation about what the qualities of leadership. And if you are entrusted to lead, you have responsibilities to make the system work, not to make yourself work, so to say. I think that's one of the first steps in the process of bureaucratization that Marc mentioned was actually, we need to train cluster leads. So you start a training program for cluster leads, which happened, of course, etc., etc. But one thing that I particularly remember is it wasn't always very simple to get agencies to step forward to be cluster leads for both the reason of are they giving up something, but also to take that significant responsibility actually of dealing with what we all know. Leading coordination is quite time consuming and nobody is happy with you, etc., etc. We know that. And your agency, Pablo, it took them a long time to feel that they also could step in and assume leadership for one of the clusters. And I think that also reflected a sense of, which we all know the IAC had, that both the Red Cross representatives were sitting on half a chair in IAC and wondering if they were going to be observers or really participants or etc. All these things played out also in the first years. UN wasn't comfortable with itself, probably still isn't totally comfortable with itself and trusting each other enough, but even less so the non-UN entities that were part of the international system. You were a bit torn between your national societies that are sort of your localized partners and the big international system. And I don't claim to know much about what happened, but I can see it from the outside that it wasn't an easy process.
I think, the clusters for me were meant to be about partnership, and Marc mentioned that, and also Margareta just now. There was the principles of partnership which were put together at that time, which is meant to guide us on where the sort of responsibilities, accountabilities were. But, to be honest with you, when it comes to action, when it comes to response, I always found it was very difficult for the cluster lead agents to be, shall we say, a bit more sort of inclusive in the leadership, in the standard setting, or in the prioritization and the decision on what projects go forward. And I think it was unfair that cluster coordinators were expected to have this schizophrenia of being loyal to their mandate and their agency, but at the same time objective and impartial. And it's a very difficult thing to ask them to do. And many of them didn't do it. Some did it very well and felt the wrath of their agency for giving up more resources to the non-agency part of it. So I think the training part was interesting, but I don't think it was necessary.
Thanks, Margareta, Jamie, and Marc, so much for this kind of deep reflection on it. And I think we will take a lot of this, our audience will take a lot of this to heart and really work on it and continue to work on it. Maybe like the last question, just to close us off, would be if you have a chance to redesign the system today with all the knowledge that you have, if you had that chance from scratch, what would be the one thing you would do differently? And second question would be one piece of advice for the future of the system. So what would you do differently? And one piece of advice that you would like our audience to take away.
It will inevitably be a bit of hindsight, but let me tell you about an example of a minister who had a great vision in his own region. He was in a way close to us. He wasn't ever the ERC, but maybe he had wanted to be, I don't know. But he felt if we in our region, Asia Pacific actually, if we can mobilize our excellent disaster management agency and create our own coordination mechanisms, we will handle everything that works in this region, including we will, as governments, have a much closer collaboration on, at that time, essentially non-political issues. So I felt that was a really strong vision. Of course, I was going to say, of course, it didn't work. It didn't materialize because he resigned for other reasons. So just to say hindsight, but new opportunities now. And I think I have seen some critique of the UN here. Don't spend your time discussing internally how you will reform yourself, but actually speak with the ones that owe you and that with whom you need to collaborate to do these changes, and set some, I think one of you mentioned this is in the acute moment, it's about money, but I think that actually punish us in the future if we let only the money lead this and don't take the opportunity to, I would say, in a sense, redistribute responsibilities and let those others actually share and take some of the responsibilities, be they governments or others that are fully capable and well-resourced to deal with it, and measure carefully when and where we are called upon to make any intervention. In a way, we go back to the system as it was in its early days, as primitive as it probably was. Governments ask for help, but now they never have a chance to do it because we call before they ask for help and say we are coming. Now, let's be honest also. There are certain crises that there isn't a government to talk to. In conflict settings with huge humanitarian needs, you probably need to negotiate your way with all parties to the conflict to be able to do something. But with some of the major crises of different kinds, I think we need to broaden the conversation and not pretend that we alone in the UN system, the NGO or the system can be the one key partner and the one key responder to these agencies. It's just not feasible and not a good idea either, I would say.
Yeah, maybe just add to that. I mean, I think that the system shouldn't let a good budget crisis pass it by. I think it's a good opportunity to reflect on some of the things that were good and some of the things that could change. And I think the point about spreading the load and not sort of hanging on this hegemony of control. And I think now's the time to do it, but do it in good faith and do it in good spirit. Don't do it because your arm's been twisted because of the financial constraints you're under. I think the lessons are quite clear from 2004, the tsunami. We saw the importance of local actors and the capacities they had. Find a way of now putting that into practice better and more consistently and universal. And I think give the internationals and the UNs and the cluster league agencies more of a normative standard setting approach a back room role rather than a front row role. I would say that's, to me, would be the way forward.
Yeah, I also think that we need to change the thinking and not put ourselves at the center of these responses. We need to put local people, local organizations, local governments at the center of these responses and think about how we can support them. So I think it's actually, we have to change the whole mindset and get away from a lot of that kind of focus on us saving lives to us supporting local actors to resolve their own conflicts, end their own conflicts, and serve their own people. We should be much more humble. We can look at ways that we can support these local actors. I think it requires a very big mindset because there has been a lot of arrogance and a lot of this kind of, white saviors, that this feeling that foreigners can solve the problems in these countries. We should really change the approach from us trying to save lives to us supporting local actors to help their own communities.
It is indeed a mindset change. It is a paradigm shift. And all we can do is commit to try our best to do so in the new cluster that is for us. So thank you, Margareta, Jamie, Marc, and thank you all for listening. We hope this episode has given you not only a deeper understanding of where clusters came from, but also insight into the principles and lessons that should guide us as we build the next generation of coordination. We look forward to continuing the conversation as our new cluster takes shape.